Hey, Changemakers, welcome to the first Agentforce episode of Sparking Innovation. We are really excited about this one. This is a podcast from Provisio, the largest Salesforce implementation partner solely for human services. I'm Tom Moran, here to inspire nonprofits and government agencies to drive change in their communities by embracing change in their organizations. And right now, society is embarking on this extraordinary AI revolution that's going to really radically change how we work and how we live, right? A lot of that is still further on down the road, but at this very moment, for mission-driven organizations in particular, there is no AI technology that's as valuable, and I think I have to stress intuitive, than Salesforce's Agentforce, which was released just last year. Using common language like I'm using right now, staff can simply create a digital workforce that can handle tedious administrative tasks without any supervision, which is really cool. And that empowers organizations with limited staffing and resources to focus more of their time on those higher value tasks that truly elevate service delivery, which is what we're all trying to do, right? I'm thrilled that we actually have a Salesforce representative joining us today to answer some burning questions about Agentforce, in particular, how nonprofits and government agencies can be inspired to actually use it. Larry Fontillas is the Director of Solution Engineering for Nonprofits at Salesforce, and Provisio VP of Data Services, John Patton, is back as well. Welcome to the pod.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here and looking forward to our chat.
Great. So, John, really quickly before we dive specifically into Agentforce, can you explain what agentic AI is and how it differs from generative AI like ChatGPT, which many people are pretty familiar with now?
Sure, yeah. So if you think about the kind of the waves of AI, we started with predictive, the idea that you're starting to look at a data set and start to figure out what's likely to happen next. And then most people got familiar with AI at the generative level, playing around with tools like ChatGPT and saying, hey, looking at the entire internet, and the context of the internet, now take this action, whatever that is, write me a poem. I'm a big fan of, write this email in iambic pentameter just to see if anyone notices. And then we all of a sudden heard about this agentic AI as kind of the next wave of AI. And what this is it's actually an agent that you're tuning to accomplish a specific role. So you might have a particular task that is painful or challenging or just cumbersome for your staff. It could be something like filling out an enrollment or creating a case or something like that that is really time consuming and tedious. And so with agentic AI, what you can basically do is program an agent to act on your behalf to accomplish a specific objective. And what's really powerful about that is that when you give it the guardrails and the roles and the tasks that it is set to perform, it then can take the context of your data set, your best practices, FAQs, knowledge articles, all of that, and it can discern what it should do in the given situation. So it is able to take contextualized information from the situation and then take the right next action kind of inside of your guardrails, but take that right next action on your behalf so that your team isn't having to manually enter that case or manually respond to questions on your website. It really is kind of like a additional staff member who's world-class at doing certain things and is always up to date on the latest and the best practices in your organization. It's really, it really is something that has the ability to let your staff focus on, your actual people staff focus on the things that are the most human and the most important for them, and let a lot of the other stuff be handled more by agents.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, John, when you said that. Like, I went back to this analogy that I've used with a couple of people here internally and actually learned from someone here internally. But you mentioned the assistant. Now, that assistant that knows everything about all the data in your system too, they understand the context of that data, which is really important. And I think that's a big difference between some of the stuff that you're seeing like ChatGPT and all that. The context of what it's looking at is the whole world. And when you're talking about organizations like nonprofits and what they want to do, they want to be very specific around what that assistant is answering about. And so the guardrails that you mentioned, being focused on your data first, is really important in that whole process. And I think that's when you can really start to see that the agent is being really focused on the way it answers and or the things that it'll do for you. So setting up those guardrails is the most important part, I think, in the Agentforce sort of setup to get your agents to do the things that you want them to do first.
Yeah, got it. So Larry, tell us just more about Agentforce in general, right? This was a major announcement at Dreamforce last year, really exciting stuff. So for people who don't know, like, what makes it so impactful and what is different about it? Why should people be excited about Agentforce if you work in a nonprofit?
So I think the exciting part is that grounding that I mentioned earlier in your own data. A lot of times when you look at how like ChatGPT started answering questions, it was very just out there trying to figure out from all of this information what's really important. And with Agentforce, we started to now ground that data or ground the answers in your data. And that's how it's able to really change the focus of the answers that are being given by the agents. The other thing that's really important about this is that your data, we'll probably have to talk about this a little bit later, but the security, the fact that we're not just throwing your data into some large language model that's being trained and everything else, and now your competitors get all this information or it's personal information that's being pushed out there. We're basically masking all that before it goes out. And so I think that's another big piece that's important. You actually had some examples of organizations where they were throwing out their business plans into ChatGPT. Like, I think there's a famous example of Samsung doing that. And then all their competitors are just, hey, this is what Samsung is doing. How do we handle it? And I think that's been really important to make sure that for nonprofits that are dealing with a lot of very sensitive information at times, that information is grounded in or masked before it's being sent into ChatGPT or whichever large language model you're using in order to get those answers. The other thing that's really different about Agentforce, and I think we started talking about this, is that you're telling the agent multiple different instructions that it can do and take action on for you. And John alluded to that, where it's like it can do something for you in the back end. And I think that's where, when you think about all the different workflows or tasks that your staff does on a day-to-day basis that could be seen as remedial or repetitive or very simple, why have your staff spend hours in the day trying to do that when you can basically let the agents do that kind of work, and then your staff can really focus on the mission critical things that they don't get a lot of time on or that get shirked for, as they try to figure out what they can do on a day-to-day basis. So I think the biggest difference here when I'm thinking about why Agentforce is so much different than, or why it's a game changer in AI, is that we're basically letting the agents do autonomous work now versus just answering questions or generating text. It's all the fun stuff that John talked about earlier, doing the iambic pentameter. I did not do that in high school. I don't remember. Okay. But I do, we have all that fun stuff. Now we're actually getting to do work stuff where I think humans and agents combined are much more powerful than what just humans and bots, for instance, were in the past.
Sure. So you mentioned it can obviously take over those tedious, repetitive tasks and stuff. Can you give us like some specific examples of how people can really think about how they could possibly use this? If you work in a nonprofit or government agency, what are some specific ways that Agentforce could be used on the front end?
Yeah, I think a lot of the early use cases that we're seeing from customers, and they're actually great use cases because people don't want to just dive in and say, agents do everything for me, right? What are the simple cases that they can start using agents for to make sure that we understand how this is going to work for us? Is it going to be the right thing, et cetera? So I like starting thinking around customer service. That is like the most common thing that I think people start to sort of ask questions around. And like a lot of times the bots, and this is where the confusion, right? We have Einstein bots, which we've had for many, many years. Bots could go in and take something like your frequently asked questions and say, hey, I have a question about, for instance, I'm a parent, I have a child, he's got some weird behaviors going on. I want to ask a question of this bot. It knows the answer through a frequently asked questions way to say, this is something that you might want to worry about, or maybe you should call someone for it. Well, as customers think about customer service now, instead of just being a frequently asked question, it's like, what's the next step? So if I ask questions of that bot, it'll just go down a linear path, get to the end, and then that's it. As I start asking questions of an agent, now it's going to know, okay, well, I've asked this certain question in a certain way, and it understands sort of the context of what I'm asking and saying, hey, maybe you need to enroll in a specific plan because there's or call a physician, or can I set up an appointment for you to talk to someone, right? Because it's hit this path where the linear path will stop. The agent will understand maybe there's other things that I should be asking, or maybe other things that I should be doing along the way, if that makes sense, right? There's a lot of different things that agents can do. So again, customer service, I think, is a really key use case. Case management, understanding cases. There's also, so that's like kind of going out to your customers. There's also the internal aspects, like being able to understand reporting better. Like there's a lot of new cases coming in based on a certain, mental health problem or something that's coming up. And you want to say to your staff, there's a lot of questions coming up with this. Maybe we need to, and then the agent can say, we're getting all these cases in, should we increase services for that type of use case, right? And that's where the agents are going to do a little bit more work than just say, hey, there's a lot of cases coming in. It's going to suggest some things that you can do with that information. And I think the bigger thing that customers can do with this is that it can scale better. As we go into a time where a lot of organizations are either cutting staff or not adding staff, this is a really easy way to take some of that work away from staff, so you don't actually have to hire staff. And you can find ways to really augment what you're currently doing to help your organization. So those are some of the like early on kind of things that we're seeing with agents at Salesforce right now. But there's many more use cases coming as organizations get comfortable with what we're doing.
Can I double click on that, Larry? Because something you said early, I think really is an important distinction. Because I would say when Agentforce was first launched, almost every use case I heard, I was like, well, that's a chatbot. Well, that's a chatbot. And that's a chatbot, right? Like, that's not agentic. Like, hey, we want to be able to respond to questions on our website. You're like, yep, it's chatbot. Like, there's only so many questions, right? Like, and what I think you're saying is that the agent isn't just grounded in the answers to the questions and the FAQ, but the agent in that situation you just raised could actually look at your case records. They could look at any cases you've opened previously. They could look at your contact record, and they could say, oh, it's Larry, and Larry has this situation, has had these cases in the past. So we've tried these other 4 interventions, and maybe those haven't been successful outcomes. So we're not going to suggest those 4 interventions or those 4 types of interventions. We're going to suggest a different type of intervention because we've already tried these and it didn't yield successful outcomes. Like, that's actually contextualized to who you are and what matters to you. And that's the difference, right? It's the data set is contextualized to what you already know about the people in your system. And I think that's really the big difference is when you have that context, all of a sudden now the agent is able to do the right thing, not just whatever is next in that decision tree that's pre-programmed.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. I think when the context of the answers and the context of what has to happen, but of course, as you mentioned, or I mentioned earlier, security is the most important part. So make sure it knows that I am Larry Fontillas and I am the one that's asking that question and I am the one that needs that help versus some other Larry that might have a different use case or different John or whatever it is out there. So that's the huge difference, I think, with agents and agentic responses right now.
Yeah, that is really, really cool stuff. So we know that one of Provisio's clients, Pacific Clinics, is the first nonprofit, I believe, to begin harnessing Agentforce. And so Provisio has been really fortunate to be kind of a fly on the wall to actually watch this implementation occur. John, I know you've been one of those flies. Can you tell us what you've seen so far in this Agentforce implementation, and like what makes you excited about it from what you've seen? How are they using it?
Yeah. So, the use case is really around their enhanced care management. And I would say it's like, just in simple terms, it's direct support for individuals versus going through like entities or insurance companies. So this is direct care. And so all of a sudden, the scale is not however many insurance companies there are. The scale is like everyone that could possibly need care from Pacific Clinics, right? Who's like qualified and eligible. And so the audience changed from like one to a bunch to one to a ton, right? And so all of a sudden now, the question is, how do you increase the enrollments of those individuals by providing the right offers to them, the right opportunities to them? How do we make that type of intake and enrollment available 24/7, 365? So it's not just a limitation of working hours. And then how do we do it in a way that harnesses all the work we've already done to build best practices, knowledge articles, and understanding of who that person is if they're already in the system? And so that's the use case for Agentforce, right? Is it's sitting there waiting to assist people as they start to come to the site and potentially consider enrollment. It knows who they are. It answers questions that are contextualized, right? It makes sure that if they're trying to enroll, it helps them if they run into errors or problems, get through that process. And it really is acting as kind of an assistant to help people in their moment of need in a 24/7, 365 kind of way. And it's been really cool to watch. And I think the thing too that I find exciting personally is the idea that, if there's an unknown person coming to the site, it's starting to understand who that person is with every single response, every single conversation, right? It's learning more about that person and then contextualizing the answer. So even if they're not in the system, right? Even if we don't know who they are, the more they interact with the agent, the more we learn about them and how they like to be spoken to and what they would like to hear and what they need to understand. And so it's building this profile to help them, even if we don't have that rich contextual grounding. It's building that profile to help them understand who they are and what they need to accomplish, so that Pacific Clinics can truly have kind of a service that's even in many cases beyond what a human could provide, because of the ability to infer from the text, the meaning, looking at previous interactions and what those people actually needed. All that data is available in real time for the agent to do the needful next thing. And that is how they're using it. It's a very compelling use case.
Yeah, and I think when I heard the use case and I was thinking about it and talking to one of my internal staff that worked on that particular case, it kind of reminded me of like being a parent. You have a child at home that has some issue going on, and you're trying to find answers. And it's like 10 o'clock at night, nobody's around. What are you going to do? And you start asking a chatbot something, and it's just basically going to give you that linear path that we talked about earlier. And a lot of times when you get frustrated as a parent and you're thinking about like, can you just answer this question? The Agentforce, the agents are starting to understand that frustration that they're hearing from the questions. And that's I think that's the part that starts to feel like, okay, we're changing what we're doing for people, because now that agent's going to feel that frustration, which I know sounds maybe a little creepy, but it feels where you're coming from now. And it's starting to say, okay, I think you need this next. Let's make sure that you get the care. And this individual kind of pointed it out to me that when a parent gets frustrated like that, sometimes they're like, all right, I quit. I'm going to call in the morning and, I'm going to stop. Right. And so they'll leave that experience. And by morning, they're like, you know what? I don't really need to do anything. But the fact is, then their child is not getting the help they need because of frustration. And so having the agent be able to understand that and actually take care of that interaction in real time is a huge difference, because now they can go get the help they need and they're not going to be frustrated. They're not going to quit. They're not going to fall off. And then, who knows what happens in that case, which I think every parent would want to know, like, I want to take care of my kids, right? And so like that really is a game changer for me.
And here's the crazy thing about that is there are instances popping up right now where the bots, like the actual agents, are more empathetic than people, right? Like that's the crazy part. He's like, well, how many times have you been on the phone? You're like just mashing the 0 button. Like, let me just talk to a person because the phone tree is horrible, right? And you don't want to wait on hold. I was like, well, actually, you could imagine a future where it's like, oh, let me talk to an agent, like a virtual agent instead of a person, right? But that's coming. That's actually coming. And in this situation, in that, what you just said, Larry, like maybe there isn't a person available, and maybe even the agent can't solve that problem because maybe you need to talk to a mental health professional who's not available at 10 p.m. Well, the agent is smart enough to know that you might be the first phone call that someone needs to make tomorrow morning, right? So it's this proactive service where Pacific Clinics in that scenario could say, okay, we had this interaction last night. We're going to put this person at the very top of our callback list, and we're going to reach out to them first thing in the morning because the sentiment of that conversation was really negative. The frustration level was really high. The need was incredibly severe. So based on those factors, we're going to reorganize your call list to put this person at the top of it, which is incredibly compelling.
That really caught my attention the way you phrase that, because it's like the agents have infinite patience and humans obviously do not. Who hasn't hung up in frustration on a call line or whatever it is? That's interesting. So anyway, go ahead, Larry. Sorry.
Yeah, I was going to say, we're working with a customer right now. I won't give too many details, but they're about 20 staff trying to handle about 70,000 calls that come in during the year. And the customer already knows that about 90% of those calls go unanswered. And so they're looking at this to basically help that. And it's basically helping connect people where something bad is happening at home and they're overseas and they're trying to find help for that, or trying to just connect with their with the individuals that are overseas. And so not think about that. They're okay right now with 90% of those. And I'm not say they're okay. They know that 90% of those calls go unanswered. So having an agent 24/7 be able to answer even 50% of those would be a huge improvement of what they have, but they can expect an agent handling probably all of those calls that are coming in and no one having to go unanswered at this point. And I think that's the value of adding in agents, where you can't add staff, you can't add staff. Here's a quick way to add in some support that will all of a sudden transform everything that you're doing as an organization. So I think it's really important to understand that the scalability of what agents can do could maybe even answer questions that you didn't even, or answer issues or problems that you didn't even know you had out there. So I think that's really important to know too.
So John, can you explain the steps that nonprofits and government agencies need to take to become AI ready? You can't just like flip a switch and all of a sudden be able to use Agentforce overnight, right? So if you want to go down that path, what do you have to do?
Well, I would say, the first thing you need to think about is not, the ChatGPT, the user interface, or what LLM you want to use. Like I would start, if you think about it like a pyramid, the base of the pyramid is the data. What is the data set that you're going to ground on and contextualize on and use for whatever component of AI is coming next, whether that be generative, predictive, or agentic, right? The first thing is, what's that data look like? And the beautiful thing about Salesforce, if you remember Salesforce from a time ago, they would talk about like the idea of multi-tenancy and the advantages of being in the cloud. There was this concept of metadata and how important metadata was, and it's data about data, right? Well, that whole model and keeping your data in a trusted, contained, contextualized environment with the metadata surrounding layer turns out is a really compelling data strategy for building an AI solution and putting an LLM against. And so that whole model of getting your data structured, prepared, and organized and harmonized into a single location ideally is that first step. So you need to have a really robust, well-considered data strategy and have that data in a place that you can put an LLM against, right? And then the great thing about Salesforce too is you can use, any of those LLMs that are out there. You can BYOLLM. Yep, that's a new acronym. You can do that, or you can use the industry leading ones that are out there right now, whether it be Amazon's or Google's or OpenAI's. It's all available to you. So you get your data organized, you choose the LLM that you want to use, and then the last piece is the user interface, which is how do you actually write your prompts or program your agents? How do you actually do that? That's the end of it. That's the final question, not the first question. So if you want to get started, you got to look at your data sources, figure out how you're going to bring those data sets into a single location so that you can make sense of. And then you got to figure out what LLM you want to use and how do you want to actually prompt against that data set through the LLM. That's how it gets started.
And I think that's from a technical perspective, that's a great answer. But I also think from the individual perspectives, a lot of end users don't think of it that way. They just think about what is the problem I'm trying to solve? And then you kind of back into where's all the data that can solve that problem. So I always think about like having workshops with people and organizations and asking them questions around, well, what are you trying to solve? Or what are the main things that you do every day? Here are ways that we can actually then use the data to solve those answers so that you can build agents around it. And we talked about the guardrails earlier too. The guardrails are really important in that conversation. So we want them to answer questions about this, but maybe not that. And if it goes down that path, we need to send them into a real person or something like that. So start to really think beyond, I think the data is important and all that, but also start thinking about how are we going to actually triage the questions that are coming in. I know we've had sort of a medical bent on this mostly during the conversation, and so triage fits in there. But in general, it's like, what are we trying to solve, right? And what are we trying to make sure we stay away from when we're trying to answer these questions?
It's a great point. The idea that one of the things I probably say too often is centralizing your data is not a use case, right? A lot of times people say we want to centralize our data. You're like, for what purpose and to what end? Because centralizing for its own sake is not that useful and very hard, right? But centralizing so that we can understand what's working with common definitions for visualization. Okay, that's a really good use case. Centralize so that we can deploy agents. Okay, that's a really good use case. Centralize so that our segment definitions are constantly up to date and dynamic across our entire data set. Beautiful. These are lovely use cases. And so to your point, Larry, I gave you the practical technical steps of how you get there. But if you don't have a reason to do it, if you don't have a why behind it, definitely not. You're not ready to start the first step in the journey. The first step of the journey is knowing where you want to go before you take the first step. So thank you for saying that. That's really, really important.
I'm a solution engineer by heart. So I know it's been many years since I was a solution engineer, but that was always the question I would ask in demos. Why do you want to do that? And I think that's the important first question that you should ask yourself when you're thinking about data readiness or anything.
Yeah. And figuring out that why is something that we do at Provisio as well. So Larry and John, thank you so much for joining this episode of Sparking Innovation. I think that, there's been a lot of buzz about Agentforce, and I think that people are like, that sounds really cool, but like I really don't fully conceptualize how it applies to me or what I could do with it. And that's why I feel like this conversation was so important to have. So thanks for your insights on that.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. And one note before we go, if this conversation about Agentforce got you excited, be sure to listen to episode 2 of the series about AI readiness. Again, AI does not just need any data, it needs great data. Check that out for insights that can help prepare your organization for artificial intelligence. And if you work for a nonprofit or a state or local government and are interested in how Provisio can help your organization save time and energy with Agentforce AI, contact us at provisiopartners.com. A link to our website is in the show description. And be sure to subscribe to the podcast to catch the next episode of Sparking Innovation. Thank you so much for listening.